Let's talk a little bit about the presidency of Vicente Guerrero. As I mentioned before, Guerrero was one of the rebel leaders during the wars for independence. He was a popular general during the early Mexican Republic. His ethnic background is interesting as well because he is a mixed race person, someone of both African and Spanish heritage, right? So he wasn't a Creole, right? He's a Costa, he's a mixed race person, becoming president, right, during the early Republic. So that's interesting. Guerrero would face some challenges, though, during his presidency. For one, Spain would attempt to reconquer Mexico during his presidency, right? So 1829, the Spanish are going to mobilize their army and they're going to send a military force to Mexico, which landed on the Gulf Coast at Tampico. Now, the Spanish military forces were led by a commander by the name of Isidro Barradas, and along with Barradas were a number of peninsulares who wanted to return to Mexico because remember, a lot of the peninsulares had left Mexico, right, after the War for Independence, but many of them wanted to return and take up their old positions back in Mexico, right? So Barradas is leading this military force and invading Mexico, but he is met with the Mexican military. Okay, and at the head of the Mexican military is Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. And ultimately, Santa Anna is going to be victorious and he's going to be successful in pushing out the Spanish forces. There's a couple of reasons for this. Eventually, Spanish forces will be cut off from all of their supplies by the Mexican military. Okay, so no fresh water, no food. And eventually you're going to have to surrender, right? You have to have supplies for your men, especially if you have a couple thousand men with you. You need food, you need water, you need other supplies. And so if you get cut off from those supplies, you're going to have to eventually surrender. Okay? Another big issue was that in the Spanish camp, yellow fever had broken out. So you had a number of people who were sick. So they don't have enough supplies. They don't have enough medicine. People are getting sick. No food, no water. And so ultimately, Barradas is forced to surrender to the Mexican military. So you have a victory there for Santa Anna. All right, and so this is going to be the last time that Spain tries to reconquer Mexico because it's a failed reconquest. All right, and so Spanish forces will ultimately be pushed out of Mexico. Now, remember, during these times of emergency, the president has pretty much the powers of a dictator, right? That was one of the centralist victories, right? So, yeah, the invasion of Mexico by Spain, you know, an attempt at reconquest, that's an emergency. So Guerrero basically is going to have the powers of a dictator, right, during that time. And so Guerrero is going to use those emergency powers to make several decrees. One of those decrees will be the abolition of slavery. Okay, so the end of slavery in Mexico. Okay, so the end of slavery there, and for the most part, slavery was already on the decline in Mexico, and so this decree didn't have, a huge impact on Mexican society, except for in Texas, which we'll be talking about next week, right? There, you do have slavery fully intact, and there is going to be some pushback against this presidential decree by Guerrero that abolishes slavery in Mexico, okay? And so this is one of the main things that Guerrero's presidency is known for, right? The abolition of slavery in Mexico. Also, Guerrero is going to officially exile all Spaniards, all peninsulares from Mexico. This process had already started after the wars for independence, where you had a number of peninsulares leaving the country, fearing for their lives. But now you have it as an actual presidential decree. They have to leave the country now. Okay, and so these are our two main examples of Guerrero using those emergency powers to make some pretty significant decrees. Now, after the Spanish forces had been kicked out of Mexico, you would think, oh, the emergency is over, right? So President Guerrero should be giving up his emergency powers, right? Which gave him pretty much the power of a dictator. But the thing is, he didn't. And eventually, you would have centralists led by the vice president again. This time the vice president is Anastasio Bustamante. You're going to have the centralists leading a revolution against President Guerrero. Okay, so yet another revolution taking place, more political turmoil. This is instability for Mexico. So the vice president, Anastasio Bustamante, is going to use his influence in the military because he's also connected to the military. He was in the military. He's going to use his influence with the military to lead a successful revolution against President Guerrero. And the argument is because Guerrero didn't give up his emergency powers after the Spanish forces were pushed out of Mexico. Right? And so this gives the Centralists an excuse to revolt against the Federalist government led by Guerrero. Okay, which is kind of interesting, right? You would think it's kind of a contradiction because the Centralists were the ones who pushed for the president to have those emergency powers during times of emergency, right? And now they're kind of using that as an excuse to revolt against the government. Well, but the argument is that Guerrero didn't give up the emergency powers even though the emergency was over. Okay, so that's the argument of the Centralists. And ultimately, this time, the Vice President, Bustamante, is going to be successful in overthrowing the government, whereas the earlier Vice President, Nicolas Bravo, was not successful. Right, so Bustamante, part of the reason why he was successful is because he had a lot of support in the military, and so he is going to overthrow the government of Vicente Guerrero, and Bustamante will become the next Mexican president. Okay, so now you have a centralist president, and Bustamante's presidency is known for its oppression. For one, you see the suppression of the freedom of the press under the rule of Bustamante. Why? Because you had a lot of Federalist newspapers that would be critical of the Bustamante government. And so in order to stop that criticism, he would simply stop those newspapers from printing. Okay, so only newspapers that supported Bustamante and his presidency could actually print. And so that is called suppression of the freedom of the press, for sure, right? You can't just stop a newspaper from printing because it's critical of your government, right? That's definitely stepping on the freedom of the press. Another act of oppression from the Bustamante government was its domination of the Congress and the judiciary. Okay, so here you have the executive branch using its power to pressure Congress and the Supreme Court to achieve its political goals. And so that's another example of oppression that takes place under the Bustamante presidency. And finally, another thing that Bustamante's presidency is really known for was the execution of Vicente Guerrero, right, the former president. And so after Guerrero was overthrown by Bustamante, he makes an attempt to get out of the country. And so when Guerrero is about to board a ship to leave Mexico, right, he's going to go into exile, he ends up getting arrested by the Mexican government because the ship captain basically double-crossed him. Right, the ship captain got paid about maybe 50,000 pesos, right, to turn over Guerrero, and so he did. And so Guerrero, the former president, is going to get arrested by the Mexican government, and Bustamante is going to try him for treason, and he is going to be executed. Eventually, Bustamante himself would be overthrown. So yet another revolution taking place in the early Mexican Republic. This time, the revolution is going to be led by Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. Okay, Santa Anna is going to revolt against Bustamante. You'll have revolts taking place throughout the country, and ultimately Bustamante will give up the presidency. Okay, so here you have a series of military coups and revolutions taking place in Mexico, which really contribute to the political instability of the country during the period of the early republic. So that brings us to the end of this lecture. If you have any questions, go ahead and email me and I will get back to you.